This is quite a last minute talk, sort of cobbled together on the train, but I'm hoping that I'm hoping it'll be useful nonetheless. So the title of the talk is Practical Metaphysics, and I basically just want to take you through some of the ways in which metaphysical inquiry, which you might have heard a bit about from Arturo's talk, I'm not sure, but I'll go on to explain in a minute, can be really useful for challenging certain perceptions of in practical issues and advancing practical debates in science and policy. Yeah, so that's the plan. Uh, just a bit about me to begin with. So I'm a fourth year PhD student. My research focuses on the metaphysics of consciousness, sort of asking how we can account for the nature of consciousness and its place in a purely physical world. And I'm also currently sort of developing a side project on the metaphysics of rewilding, and I'll have a bit to say on that topic in the sort of second half of this talk. Right. So the plan for this talk, I'm going to go through three things. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what metaphysics is, as I understand it at the very least. I'm then going to talk about some of the conditions and some of the examples under which metaphysics can be useful to us. And I'm going to end with a newish example that I haven't seen applied. So, I haven't seen much metaphysics of rewilding, essentially in the literature. And I'm going to close by talking a little bit about that and why I think it's important. And more generally, this talk is meant to give you a flavor of the kinds of issues that you would engage with in a course on practical metaphysics, and I can answer some questions about that more generally in the Q&A, and also at the end of the talk, I'll say a little bit about say in more detail what we do in a course like this. Okay, so starting off on what is metaphysics. So if you take a look at these questions, do colors exist? Could your red be my green? Is time travel paradoxical? What makes someone a person? Why are some things in the universe conscious? When does a collection of entities form a unity? So a kind of broad range of questions here. And I think some of these people often find themselves thinking about. So people often think about colors and time travel and the conditions under which people are a person, somebody is a person, sorry. I think if you've ever asked these sorts of questions, the chances are you've probably done some metaphysical theorizing, even if it hasn't been explicitly obvious to you. And I think metaphysics can look quite abstract, the kinds of subject matters that we deal with, the kinds of approaches that we have to metaphysics, kind of tools that we use. And I think it's sometimes difficult to see what sort of implications metaphysical theorizing could have for our lives. I'll go back to these questions. I mean, some of these, maybe it's clearer, some of them are clearer than others. It's maybe quite clear that asking what makes somebody a person is going to have important implications for debates in ethics. It's less clear what the value, apart from just intrinsic interest, right, is in asking when a collection of entities form a unity. But I think that lots of important disagreements involve metaphysical theorizing, and often very abstract topics can have pretty serious implications for how we deal with the more practical issues. So just to tell you a little bit about what metaphysics is, just to try and define it a bit. I mean, we get the term from Aristotle's work, famous Greek philosopher, though we didn't get it from Aristotle himself. Basically, when people came to compile his works, they ended up putting all of the stuff that we call metaphysics after Aristotle's writings on physics. And metaphysics then literally just means after physics. It's the stuff that comes after Aristotle was discussing the physics stuff. And the contemporary usage, I mean, that's the etymology, but the contemporary usage is a bit different. So to start with, I mean, pick any topic, really. So I've given a list here. So physics, chemistry, biology, geology, social theory, psychology, consciousness studies, really anything that we could be academically interested in. There's likely going to be what's called a metaphysics of that topic. There are going to be people asking metaphysical questions about the topic. Metaphysics is basically asking very general and abstract questions about a topic. And typically, anyway, metaphysics is meant to help us settle disagreements that we're having in an area where the scientific, or what we might call empirical evidence, seems to provide equal to support to both or all parties. Where we've got a case where there is a disagreement about maybe the nature of biological individuals or something, and we agree on all of the data, but we still seem to be disagreeing. And also, I should note that metaphysics often also helps us pose new empirical questions. So it doesn't sort of just transcend these debates about data and science completely. Often how we formulate a metaphysics can push us in new directions in science to, like, seek out or do new experiments. And one of the things that it's really important to do, to be able to distinguish, and what we do a lot of in a practical metaphysics course, is basically being able to tell when a disagreement is a metaphysical disagreement, as opposed to a purely scientific or empirical disagreement. And that seems to change how we conduct the debate, how we conduct ourselves when we're disagreeing with each other. I'm going to talk about some examples of that in a moment. But contemporary metaphysicians are often interested primarily in these sorts of questions. I've given two what I consider to be pretty fundamental questions that metaphysicians spend a lot of time thinking about in different domains. So the first is, what sorts of entities exist in the world? You might think that that's a scientific question in some way, right? So, do electrons exist, for instance? Sounds like it's something that can be verified or falsified by scientific evidence. Often the things that we're asking questions about, though, it's not so straightforward to settle the existence questions with science. So one question we might be interested in, for instance, is whether numbers exist or whether colors exist. And it seems that we could agree on all of the kind of empirical facts. We could agree on everything that we see. We could agree that, we can do mathematics, and something seems to be going on when we look at objects and give color reports. But there might be these further questions about, whether numbers really exist or colors really exist that we just can't get at by performing experiments. And then the second kind of question that metaphysicians ask is, okay, something exists in the world. Maybe you've got good arguments to believe in the reality of numbers, but you might also be interested in how they exist in the world. So in other words, what do numbers or colors depend on for their existence? And some dependence questions are more scientific. So we can ask about, whether one event depends on another event, whether or not, for instance, the moving of the car depends, does that depend on my starting the engine? Other types of questions to do with dependence seem a lot more metaphysical. They seem to transcend the scientific evidence. So one question that we might be very interested in is what consciousness depends on. So we might think that human beings, for instance, are conscious. They have inner subjective lives, but we might not know how consciousness sort of links up with the rest of the world. We might not know if it depends on the physical goings on in the world or the chemical goings on in the world, or maybe it doesn't depend on any of those things, and we need a kind of separate theory of consciousness. So that's the kind of second way in which we ask metaphysical questions. And I've just taken this nice term that I think is Plato's, that when we do these kinds of investigations, asking how things exist in the world, we're often asking whether our theories or terms carve nature at the joints. That's meant to be a kind of nice metaphor for understanding how we kind of partition the world when we do metaphysics. Just a quick note here, and this is something that we would look in more detail at in a practical metaphysics course. But I've said that metaphysicians are interested in these kinds of distinctly metaphysical questions. They're not scientific questions. They seem to go beyond that. But philosophers have very different views on how metaphysics and science relate. So you get some people that think that metaphysics is science. So Quine, for instance, very famous 20th century philosopher, thought that metaphysics and science were continuous. And one example of that is that it's when we're looking at very complicated things like quantum mechanics, it's often quite difficult to distinguish what the philosophers are doing from what the physicists are doing when they're asking these kinds of hard questions about existence or dependence. For simplicity in this talk, I am just going to assume that metaphysics and science can in some sense be pried apart. So metaphysicians are interested in distinctly metaphysical questions. That's more just a sort of scaffolding tool for this talk. It just makes things run a bit more smoothly. Okay, so I've given you a brief gloss on what metaphysics is, and I now just want to talk. I'm going to run through two examples of how we might use metaphysics to think about certain topics. And this hopefully will give you a bit of an example of how metaphysical inquiry runs more generally as well. So here's the first question. Here's the first example. So I've already said a little bit about asking these questions about colors and consciousness, but we might want to know what colors are. I might just want to start with the question of what are colors. That looks like a pretty metaphysical question. And I think it might seem like quite a simple question as well. So we are pretty familiar with colors. A lot of us are from our everyday experiences. Objects look as though they have colors. But beyond that, when you start probing that question from a metaphysical angle, at least, it starts to become quite difficult to say what the colors actually are. So I'm going to give you a couple of opinions that some people might hold about colors, and maybe you'll latch on to one of them immediately and think, okay, that's what colors are. I know what colors are. But know that I imagine a lot of you are going to disagree on which one is the right one to log on to, and that's important. Okay, so here are four views, no way exhaustive, that we might have about colors. So take four imaginary people. So Honoria, who thinks that colors are on the surfaces of objects. Sort of standard view of, look, I look at objects and I see the colors on the surface. That's what colors are. Vinit disagrees, and he thinks that colors are only in the mind. They're not on the surfaces of objects. They're color experiences are things that happen in our mind, and that's really what colors are. And Liam thinks that colors don't exist at all. We shouldn't be saying that colors are real things in the world. One reason he might think this is that there are certain what we call debunking arguments in evolutionary theory that aim to show that there isn't any objective reality to colors. We've kind of just evolved in a way to kind of pick out useful patterns in the world, but there's nothing that really corresponds to the term color that we should talk about as really existing. And then David thinks something entirely different. David thinks that colors are the light waves that kind of, go into our heads. So these are different theories you could hold about what colors really are. And one thing that's interesting here is it seems like Honoria, Vinit, Liam, and David can all agree on the scientific or empirical facts about color. There's a very brief gloss of those facts. It is not exhaustive, but they can agree that objects reflect light, right? They can agree that our brain processes the light waves from the objects in certain ways, and they can also agree that we respond to those light waves in fairly predictable fashion. Seems okay. But it seems like they can still have this substantial disagreement about the nature of color, so on what color is. And, you might think maybe that, if science can't settle this debate, maybe it's not a debate that's worth having. And that's a view that we would explore and take seriously in the course. But if you think there is a substantial question here, if you think, no, we should be able to say that colors are something, we can give a theory of color. But science doesn't settle that this disagreement we're having. We might wonder what does. What do we need to do to convince, bring one person around to a particular view on color? So deciding on the best metaphysics of color seems like it's going to involve moving beyond the scientific or empirical evidence. And what it seems like we need to do is give metaphysical arguments for preferring one theory over another. And this involves a bunch of things, but typically it's going to involve kind of weighing up the theoretical or ideological commitments and costs of a theory. And in a metaphysics course, we'd look at kind of some of the metaphysical tools that we use to make these arguments in detail, and we consider whether it's good to use those tools, why, when we use those tools, it doesn't seem like we're doing science. What exactly are we doing? Often metaphysicians revise the kinds of tools that they use. To give you one example, that metaphysicians often use conceptual tools that involve ideas about possibility and necessity. So kind of modal reasoning that ends up being quite informative about some of these issues. So here is, and I'm not, partly because we're short on time, and also because some of these tools take quite a bit of time to set up. I'm not going to set up any hardcore metaphysics arguments here, but I'm just going to kind of give you a way that we might argue for one of these views. So here's how we might proceed with color. So we might say that we identify colors by how they appear to us. That's the kind of starting point. That's kind of what picks out the category of colors. We identify, red by how we perceive red. We don't start by identifying, light waves, for instance. We start by saying, look, that's a red object. And it seems like the perceived redness of like an apple, for instance, isn't the same as the light waves that reflect off the object. We could go into quite a lot of detail here, but hopefully the basic point we can grasp is that these things seem different. Light waves seem different from your perception of redness, however you think they're going to ultimately end up relating. And some arguments suggest that perceived redness isn't reducible to brain activity either. The activity in your brain doesn't seem to be the exact same thing as the redness that you literally experience. Various interesting arguments that make that point. So one suggestion here, one way to make that argument would be to say, well, there's nothing contradictory, there's no incoherence in thinking about a being that can perceive redness, but it lacks a brain. So two ways that might be possible. There are other ways as well, but one suggestion is that you could have aliens with, who are physical. They're grounded in physical things, but they are so totally different from us that nothing in their physiological makeup looks like a brain, but nevertheless they can perceive redness. So that's one way that we might think that it's hard to reduce colors to brain activity specifically. And another suggestion is that, well, maybe some non-physical beings are possible. Maybe none of them actually exist, but maybe there's nothing incoherent about non-physical beings. If you've ever wondered whether or not the world could be a dream, or if you could be in the Matrix, or be a brain in a vat, you're kind of entertaining this idea that there's there could be no physical world, but nevertheless you'd be perceiving redness. You don't have to think you are in the Matrix or something to think that that's possible. And crucially, it's only really the possibility of this sort of thing that we need when we're doing this very general analysis. And we talk a little bit about why that is in the course, and also if anyone wants me to elaborate on that in the Q&A, I'm happy to. The main thing to take away from this is that you might disagree with a bunch of these claims I've just made about non-physical beings being possible, but the disagreement seems to be a metaphysical one. So if you think that non-physical beings are logically impossible, it's just completely incoherent to imagine a being that perceives redness but doesn't have any kind of physiological makeup. That's fair enough, but also it doesn't seem like the scientific or empirical evidence would decide that point. It doesn't seem like there are many experiments we can do that would tell us one way or another whether such beings are possible. And these sorts of questions don't exist in a vacuum. So how we think about the metaphysics of color, what colors really are, ends up having really important implications for how we do, a bunch of different things, but one is color science. So what the correct metaphysics of color is, one thing it will help with is it will direct the search for what a lot of people call novel colors. So these are colors that we don't ordinarily experience, but we might be able to under certain conditions. I think there's been some stuff in the news relatively recently about another one of these experiments where people have said that they've found a new color that no one's ever seen before. what we think colors are matters a lot just for getting the scientific questions right for that debate. And it can also help us answer other scientific questions like, whether non-human animals experience colors. Do they experience the same kinds of colors that we do? And then there are more, it can still be scientific, but less scientific questions of enterprises about aesthetics, for instance, that color metaphysics helps, or that bears on. So projects about the nature of aesthetic visual experiences often make crucial assumptions about what colors are. Okay, so that's the first example. Second example is a little bit different. So lots of us, I think, believe in, I mean, this is a weird sentence in some ways, but lots of us believe in corporations and groups more generally, right? We think these things exist. We think that, Amazon as a company exists in some way. I said here, I think that law firms and small fishing businesses, I think they exist. Okay. I mean, in some ways that's a metaphysical claim, but what exactly does that mean? What sort of implications does that have? So here's a disagreement that you might have about the nature of groups or corporations. Using the same people again, David doesn't get any airtime, sadly, but Honoria thinks, right, that groups are something more than their individual members. They don't just reduce to their individual members. Vinit thinks that groups are reducible to their individual members. A group is really just nothing more than the people that make it up. That's it. And Liam thinks that groups don't exist at all. Okay, so why would this sort of dispute matter? So we've seen that with the color example, right, that these are kind of distinctly metaphysical questions. And here there seem to be some important implications for things like law and corporate responsibility that people are starting to pay quite a lot of attention to now, actually, in philosophy. So if you think that groups are something more than their individual members, another thing you might think is that groups can act or be held responsible in ways that their members can't be. So a large corporation, for instance, might have moral responsibilities that are over and above the moral responsibilities of individuals within that corporation. I think a lot of us have that intuition. Corporations can be held responsible in ways that individual members can't. And like I said, that's going to have very important implications for how we draw up laws concerning those corporations, how we think about corporate responsibility. So there's a kind of strange metaphysics of groups question that we can ask that seems very immediately to have important implications. And again, it seems like Honoria, Vinit, and Liam, they can all agree on the scientific or empirical evidence about groups, but their disagreement needs to be settled by some metaphysical argument. And I'm going to give you another example of that. I think this one's a little bit more precise. So, I mean, this is the argument. So it goes, groups can't perform acts over and above their individual members because action requires consciousness. Since groups clearly don't have a special kind of consciousness above their individual members, Amazon isn't thinking independently of its members, for instance, groups can't act. So if you disagree with that argument, or if you like that argument, it seems like you are going to be thinking about these distinctly metaphysical issues again. So these are two ways in which we could challenge the argument. I think one may be more plausible than the other. So that argument assumed that action requires consciousness. So if we're going to respond to that assumption, we're going to need to engage in some sort of deep metaphysical theorizing about the nature of action. We might look around for arguments or intuitions that suggest that actions actually can be performed without consciousness. We might take AI as a nice example. We might even think that we've got intuitions about group action without consciousness that gets us some way towards vindicating the argument. So that might be one way. That's sort of one thing we can do. And notice that we're engaging with these general questions about what an act is and how it relates to another general term like consciousness. We're not doing experiments necessarily. We might want to draw on empirical data, but the primary thing is the metaphysical. Then the second way that we could challenge this argument is we could ask quite an alarming question, really, is can groups have consciousness? I mean, I think that seems very odd to suggest that groups could have consciousness. Some arguments in the consciousness studies literature actually suggest that, though. I mean, it is quite a strange suggestion that a group could be thinking over and above its individual members. But lots of people, for instance, disagree about why we find consciousness in the world. What causes it? You might think, for instance, that sufficient complexity is sufficient for consciousness in some way. It doesn't matter that you don't need a kind of organism to have a brain, for instance, or even to be biological. What you need are the right kinds of like functional setups, basically, to get consciousness. And you might think if groups perform, though, if groups have the right functions, then they're candidates for being conscious. There's a nice argument in the Metaphysics of Mind literature that makes this case about the United States. I think the paper is literally called something like, if physicalism is true or materialism about consciousness is true, then the United States is probably conscious. And it's quite convincing. Right. So I've given you two ways in which, or two examples of a metaphysical debate, and I've just kind of tried to gloss how some of these disagreements seem to be beyond the scientific. They seem to involve a distinctly metaphysical kind of theorizing. And I now want to close by giving you another example of an application of metaphysics that, I mean, I've basically seen no attention to in the literature. And yeah, I mean, it's something that I'd be very, very keen kind of to integrate into a practical metaphysics course, because I think it's just so topical now as well. So yeah, we've seen that metaphysics can help us solve some practical disputes. It might, or at least aid in those practical disputes about corporate responsibility or how we should direct our science of color. That's those examples are fairly uncontroversial. But yeah, I'm now going to suggest this other application of metaphysics, which is rewilding. So just to give you a very brief gloss, rewilding is supposed to be this process of giving land back to nature by performing managed interventions on our landscape. So releasing keystone species into a habitat, such as beavers, in order to increase the complexity and stability of that landscape, for instance. And rewilding is meant to be a pretty topical issue at the moment because it seems like it might be a good way to kind of mitigate climate damages, for instance. So it seems like how we think about rewilding is very important. But I think there's scope within the rewilding debate that's kind of being had at the moment to identify distinctly metaphysical issues again. And this isn't something that people seem to be doing, which is interesting. So here are three views on rewilding. By no means exhaustive, but just these are our toy examples. So Honoria thinks that we should rewild, we should be in the business of rewilding because we've got a duty to give back to nature. And she also thinks that rewilding should aim at producing landscapes that are, eventually at least, independent from human intervention. Vinit, in contrast, still thinks we should rewild, but that's because humans benefit from increases in wild spaces. That's his primary, that's the primary value driving him, at least. And he also thinks that rewilding projects shouldn't aim at producing landscapes that are independent of human intervention. That's not something that really matters so much to him. That's actually, he actively resists that, let's suppose. And then finally, Liam thinks that we shouldn't rewild. Maybe he's got other reasons, but the one we're going to focus on is that he thinks rewilding projects treat animals as proxies for human aims. They make beavers, they put beavers into a landscape and get them to do stuff that we want, basically. And he thinks that's morally objectionable, partly because he thinks that you don't get a kind of true notion of wilderness in that sense. And also that often once you release animals, they kind of just do whatever they want. And when that isn't in line with what we've anticipated, we often, do things like culling them, for instance. And he thinks that that's not a good idea. So there are three views on rewilding. And it seems like at least some of these disagreements should be settled by just doing more scientific and empirical research into rewilding. It's definitely, the field is definitely more emerging than some of the more established sciences, right? But it also seems like a lot of these disagreements are going to be metaphysical ones again. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how that might be the case. So let's think about Liam's claim, right, that we shouldn't treat keystone species like beavers as proxies for our own aim. Sorry, we shouldn't be releasing beavers into wetland habitats in order to, for the, and with the expectation that they change that landscape in certain ways that will well, line up with our aims. Maybe they benefit us, maybe they benefit animals as well, but that's not how we should be utilizing beavers. I mean, you think what you want about that, but it seems like his claim is moral and it's also normative. Often we use those interchangeably. And it seems like this moral view that we shouldn't be using animals in this way is actually going to be informed, partially at least, by the metaphysics of animals, by how we categorize animals, not in a biological way, but in a metaphysical one. So here's a fairly popular way to draw up sort of metaphysical animal categories. This isn't this kind of goes beyond biology. It's more about the kinds of animals that we think exist in the world, especially in relation to us. So the first is domestic animals. So these are animals that we've chosen basically to share our homes with. These are animals like dogs and cats, right? Those are obvious examples. And then there are liminal animals. These are animals that, okay, we share our spaces, we cohabit with them. We don't really invite them into our homes in the same way. You know, rats in your garden, pigeons, spiders, things like that. And then there are wild animals, and it seems to matter how we define this, but loosely as a starting gloss, we can say these are animals that are, to a large extent, independent of our spaces we typically occupy, and we don't typically interact with, at least not so much as domestic and liminal animals. So we'll get back to Liam in a moment, but we might think about whether these distinctions make sense, and we might think about what the best way to define these categories are. So does the category of wild animals, for instance, require this independence clause, independent of our spaces, for instance? Can you have wildness without that sort of independence? And this kind of categorization is a metaphysical project. You should base it, obviously, on, your empirical scientific understanding of the world, but it also seems to go beyond literally the evidence. And you might think, there are interesting questions we can ask, right, about the status of some domesticated animals like cows with these sorts of distinctions, whether that should force us to change how we've defined domesticated animals. Animals that exist in zoos or wildlife sanctuaries might create interesting problems as well. We might ask if these neatly fit into those categories I just suggested. So Liam's claim, right, that we ought not to treat keystone species as proxies seems to depend on how we draw up the metaphysics of animal categories. So you owe different things to an animal depending on the category into which it falls. That seems quite intuitive, right? So you owe different things to your dog, which is a domestic animal, than you do to a rat that lives in your garden, a liminal animal. And those distinctions, they might seem really obvious, but they also really do kind of normatively or morally prescribe. They tell us, or they make us think in certain ways about what our obligations towards those animals are. So here's a way to kind of start unpicking Liam's claim a little bit, or at least asking metaphysical questions about it. We might ask, okay, well, what category do rewilded beavers fall into? And hopefully it's clear that what we say here is going to have implications for what our obligations to those animals are. Okay, well, it seems like rewilded beavers aren't domestic animals on any kind of sensible understanding of that term, right? We don't share, unless you live in the rewilded wood with beavers, and you probably shouldn't be there, you don't share your homes with them. They don't seem to be liminal animals either. Rewilding projects are often a lot more detached from the kinds of spaces that we live in. a lot of the time anyway. But rewilded beavers also don't seem to satisfy our standard intuitions about what a wild animal is, at least given how rewilding projects are often done. That's part of Liam's worry, right? That we're using these animals as proxies. They're not truly wild. So we might ask, okay, well, do they occupy a distinct category? Have we got enough categories here to fit all the animals? We might ask if a rewilded animal is different from a domestic, liminal, or wild animal. For short, I'm just going to call this category R animals. This is a stipulative category. I'm just sort of stipulating that maybe this category exists. It seems like by introducing a new metaphysical category, the category of R animals, we get to challenge part of Liam's argument. So if R animals aren't wild animals, then our obligations to R animals might be very different to our obligations to wild animals. So one thing, we could try and diagnose Liam's worry here by saying, okay, well, maybe his intuitions about his obligations to, or our obligations to rewilded beavers are kind of skewed. They're kind of misguided because he's considering rewilded beavers to be wild animals, and they're not. And it seems like this kind of very simple failure to appreciate that there's a fourth category here. I'm not saying there isn't, just stipulating it as an argument. It's led him to make a mistake. So we might not be treating wild animals inappropriately here. We might be treating our animals appropriately when we do these kinds of projects. Okay, so just quickly, here's one way that Liam could double down. He could say that rewilding projects, well, they shouldn't aim at producing wild animals. Sorry, they should aim at producing wild animals, not our animals. And maybe he argues this isn't possible. We're always going to have to perform interventions on these sorts of projects. So we shouldn't be in the business of rewilding. But obviously that doesn't tell us how we should treat the currently existing R animals. It doesn't tell us what our obligations to these animals are. He could also argue that the category should be rejected. There isn't really a category of R animals. We can get on, we can accommodate rewilded beavers using the distinctions we've already got, domestic, liminal, and wild. But notice here, whatever you think about that debate, and I've tried not to come to a specific conclusion on purpose. This debate does still seem, in an important way, to transcend the empirical scientific facts. We're basically going back to this term I used before about, the questions metaphysicians are interested in. We're arguing about the best way to carve nature at the joints, to make distinctions in the world. And I think I've got time for this. We're also, there's another question we can ask about this debate. So we can ask, well, take Honoria's claim, right, that the wild is, in some sense, the proper notion of wild requires the absence of human intervention. That's what she thinks rewilding projects should aim at, because she thinks it's important to give back to nature. Okay, well, we can question in a metaphysical way whether that's the right way to think about wilderness. So here's one way we might do this. So we might imagine, philosophers really like imagining examples, even if they're not true, they like kind of imagining possibilities that maybe refute a claim. So imagine a rewilding project, right, that gradually increases the amount of biodiversity in a landscape. So first we introduce a keystone species like beavers, and then we kind of carefully manage that species and we start managing the landscape more generally. And we imagine that the landscape gets wilder and wilder with more and more complexity emerging in the ecosystem. And then we ask, what happens to the amount of required human intervention here? Well, it's not implausible to think that, at least in some cases, as the degree of wilderness increases, the amount of required human intervention actually remains the same, or even increases. That won't be true in all cases, but it might be true in some. That seems especially plausible, right, if rewilding projects have aims other than giving back to nature. So continuing to allow humans to interact with and learn from nature. A lot of landowners think that's a really important aspect of rewilding for them. And we might think that raises, that means you're constantly going to be having to have a hands-on approach to and performing interventions on this landscape. Or maybe, as your ecosystem becomes richer, sure, there are some senses in which it's more stable, but increased complexity and richness also means that we have to kind of do more complex science, often even performing interventions on that landscape in order to manage and protect that landscape. So that counterexample is just supposed to bring out a way in which a landscape can increase in wilderness without decreasing the need for human intervention. So it's meant to challenge, basically, Honoria's idea that the world requires independence. I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying that this would be one sort of metaphysical way to go, challenge this notion of independence. Okay, so that basically brings me to the end. So we've now looked, in this example, or cases of people categorizing animals in different ways, having different notions of wilderness, and it seems like engaging in doing some metaphysics allows us to assess the consequences of these concepts and whether or not they're desirable concepts to have. So Honoria's notion of the wild, for instance, seems to imply that humans shouldn't benefit from rewilded landscapes. And we might ask if that's a good notion. We might ask if that's the right metaphysics of rewilding to have. Right. Sorry, I'm having to move a little bit quickly on this last bit. So just to say a little bit about the course more generally, everyday or practical metaphysics, it seems really important to be able to think about and identify when a debate is metaphysical rather than just scientific or empirical. It's really important, given how we conduct ourselves, we conduct ourselves differently when we're disagreeing about evidence as opposed to when we're disagreeing about the metaphysics. And applying metaphysics to these debates like rewilding seems to help clarify our practical aims and opinions. And so in a practical metaphysics course, we'd basically be looking to introduce you to aspects of social, scientific, and political problems that are distinctly metaphysical, but often kind of fly under the radar or aren't separated out properly from other sorts of projects. And we'd also, and I can maybe say more if people are interested in the Q&A, we'd also look at how distinctly metaphysical tools, which I've been a bit vague on, are deployed to answer these questions.